He kōna ipurangi tēnei nā te reo irirangi o Aotearoa.
When you think of a treasure hunter, it's hard to escape the images that come to mind. For me, it's immediately eye-patched pirates on desert islands, grinding their R's, burying wooden chests under moonlight. X marks the spot. It could also be leather jacket, fedora-wearing archaeologists, crashing through the wilds of a jungle looking for lost civilizations, navigating wild rivers and booby traps at every turn. Or maybe the scorching hot sun beating down on sand dunes as an intrepid explorer wrapped in white linen riding a camel sets out to find the catacombs of a mythical pharaoh with the warning of an ancient curse. The image is less clear when it comes to New Zealand treasure hunting, because much of our country's treasure hunting has been done where no one can see it, in the 2,300 shipwrecks that lay dormant on the seabed around New Zealand, just waiting for their hidden cargo to be extracted by someone brave enough to dare. And on many occasions, that someone was Kelly Tarlton. One of Kelly Tarlton's final hunts was for the oldest European artefacts in New Zealand, the anchors of the St. John Baptiste. One of those anchors is still thought to be lying at the bottom of Doubtless Bay. 40 years later, we're going to finish what he started. Despite being a sailing obsessive, I'm not much of a diver, and I've got no experience with treasure hunting. Thankfully, Fiona Tarlton, Kelly's daughter, has put me in touch with many of Kelly's old mates, and I'm hoping they'll help me to figure out how to find the anchor. I'm Hamish Williams, and this is Kelly Tarlton's final treasure hunt. By the time Kelly Tarlton was 30, he was husband to Rosemary and father to Nicole and Fiona. The year was 1968. He'd turned his hobby of scuba diving into a career. He'd quit his New Zealand post job in Whangarei and relocated to Dunedin, where he worked at the southern city's Port Chalmers as a commercial diver on underwater construction. It was paying well enough to support his young family, however, it wasn't what he wanted to be doing. He'd caught the bug for diving on wrecks up around Northland, and he had dreams of finding sunken treasure. But to do that, he was going to need some help.
I joined Kelly back in the 1960s. I sort of hung around with Kelly for 20 or so odd years. We lived together in the same room, done trips together. I probably spent more time with him than everyone else put together.
John Dealing is 83 years old. He met Kelly in the late 1960s. John was hanging out on a Chinese junk called the Golden Lotus when Kelly hired it with another mate, Wade Doak, to dive the wreck of the Royal Tar off Kowau Island in the Hauraki Gulf. From then on, Kelly kept calling John up to go on diving adventures with him. John and Kelly were incredibly close, to the point that they would share a bed if they were in a pinch for accommodation. 60 or so years later, John's home is full of old treasure he found with Kelly.
Like for instance, I got piles of coins up there in that porthole, gold coins and all sorts of stuff, and a lot of them off the Gelignite.
The Gelignite was the shipwreck that made Kelly Tarlton famous. His early efforts at treasure hunting had already got some attention for locating the wreck of the Boyd, a wooden sailing ship which was burned in Whangaroa Harbour in 1809 after a violent encounter with Māori. The Boyd was a historically significant discovery, But when people think of shipwrecks, they tend to get more excited by coins and jewellery than scorched fragments of timber. With the Gelignite, Kelly quite literally struck gold. Kelly recorded a video of himself talking about his adventure on tape. We've played parts of it earlier. The tape, just by the way, is more than 50 years old, so it's a bit scratchy in places.
Our most exciting salvage has been the treasure from the Gelignite. She took her cargo of coins to the bottom at the wild Three Kings Islands, 50 miles north of New Zealand, in 1902. Many perished when the ship went down, but the worst sufferings were endured by the survivors on this raft, 8 of whom died before being rescued.
The Gelignite was an Australian passenger steamer that sank at the Three Kings Islands with thousands of gold coins on board, about $3.5 million worth in today's money.
Soon, salvage expeditions were trying to get the cargo of silver and gold coins, but after 3 divers had died of the bends, it was abandoned as impossible. 66 years later, we set out to test our more modern equipment against the currents in the 150-foot depths that had killed our predecessors.
One of the reasons I guess I got hooked in was because of my engineering skills.
Sir John Gallagher, a former Hamilton city councillor, but probably more well known for his family's electric fence company, was part of the crew as well.
But also we had a scuba filling station here, because in the early days we had our scuba bottles, we had to actually send them to Auckland to get filled.
Kelly purchased the salvage rights to the Gelignite, which included its coordinates. But in 60 years, a lot can happen to a wreck. Shipwrecks move. Currents and storms and underwater landslides can all hide or relocate artefacts. And you can't always trust the person who wrote the original coordinates. Kelly tried to give himself every advantage. He pored over old ship journals, news report, government documents, looking for every small nugget of information which might help him in his search. And even with all that info, it still wasn't a sure thing. Most of the time, you're lucky to have more than 5 metres of visibility underwater. You could swim right past a wreck and not even notice it was there.
When you looked at the area where the Gelignite was, it's sort of in a semi sort of bay with all rocks and cliffs all around it. What you did is you went in on a wave. You didn't have your scuba gear on, but you had just your wetsuit and stuff. And you grabbed hold of the cliffs and the wave went away, you'd scramble up and get a bit further. And finding you could walk around or climb around in the cliffs, that's where we found bits of timber and bits of brass and stuff. So we knew the wreck was not far away.
We soon found wreckage, but after a week of searching, all we had to show for our efforts was a few old bottles.
The biggest issues they faced was the lack of visibility underwater and the fact that the wreck was covered by 60 years of sand. Kelly had an idea of how to combat both those things.
He's a nerd, but he's an outdoor man, you know what I mean? He's a lumberjack nerd. He comes up with these brilliant ideas all the time, and they're just out of this world. He revolutionised digging underwater with water jets. He said, look, I've got this Hamilton 3-phase jet boat, which him and I used to go out on all the time. And he said, I'm thinking I might put a hose pipe off the back of it and run it down 100 feet underwater and use the water jet to blast sand. He said, look, I'll tell you what, I'll write a letter to Hamilton Jet and see what they think and how can I do it. Well, by the time they got back with the answer a week later, Kelly and I had made the unit up, went out to the spot and tried it out, and it worked to success. When we got home a few days later, we got this letter back from Hamilton Jet saying it can't be done. We'd done it.
Kelly and John called their invention the suction dredge. Well, they didn't really invent it. Suction dredges had been around since the late 1800s, but Kelly and his crew iterated and improved on the design. At its simplest, a suction dredge could be a fire hose anchored to the bottom, blasting out sand and mud with a powerful jet of water from the boat's engines. But over time, Kelly and his crew learned to exploit the Venturi effect and airlifts, making them more efficient and easy to work with. Eventually, they developed handheld dredges which could vacuum up vast amounts of sand and silt, sift out any potential treasure, and carry it to the surface for sorting. It was Kelly's treasure hunting superweapon.
We throw all this fire hose over and get it all rigged up and start it up, and we gave it heaps. We had the boat running for half an hour, and Kelly and I looked at one another and said, well, who's going down to check it? And so we sort of tossed a coin and I lost. I went down the hose and all I could see was dust and like a sandstorm all around me, and I couldn't see this far, but I'm going down the hose and all of a sudden it opened up like I was diving in a bottle of gin. And when I looked down, I couldn't believe it. The thing after half an hour dug a hole as big as a house. It just blew all the sand out. I couldn't believe it. It was a massive hole. Anyway, I shoot up and said, hey, Kelly, just keep it on idle and come on down and have a look. He couldn't believe the size of this hole. The success of this thing was just astronomical.
Suddenly, Wade found a small pile of coins in a patch of sand. We were onto the treasure. In 30 seconds, we'd gathered up $30. When that first bag of coins was poured out on the deck of the salvage boat, everyone went wild with excitement. Back below, we scooped up handsful and shoveled them into sacks. We were working on a solid reef of compressed coins. Some lumps we broke out weighed 70 pounds.
Over 10,000 gold and silver coins were recovered from the Gelignite, far surpassing anyone's expectations.
The gold coins were in perfect condition, still shiny after 68 years under the sea.
Kelly even took his daughter Nicole along with him on the dive.
That first summer, so I just turned 14, Dad took me down and he popped me next to a seam of rocks. So I was left there with a little bag to collect the silver coins and the coins that came out of this seam of rocks. I decided to go hunting for something else that was more exciting because I knew that they'd already found that and they would just handle it themselves in a little bit. And he caught me going exploring and I got told off. But it was, so I was a little bit narked and I had a bit of gold fever at that time. It was a crazy combination.
Eventually, our seam of coins thinned and began to peter out. Each day we'd been diving from daylight till dark, and now the time came when we had to return to the mainland.
In today's prices, the gold alone would be worth over $5 million. While that sounds like a lot, the Gelignite wasn't a set-you-up-for-life sort of payday. Anything to do with boats comes with a big price tag. And once you throw in diving equipment, paying back investors, it all adds up. The way that Kelly financed this all was through what they called syndicates. It meant that other people would invest into the treasure hunt and then take a percentage of what was discovered. Often the investors were the other divers working with Kelly. He usually couldn't pay them wages. Instead, he offered a cut of the booty, if they found any. Other times, it could be wealthy investors from around the world. There's a whole subculture of people investing in treasure hunts, and as you might imagine, it attracts some larger-than-life characters.
Gerald.
Hello, Kelly.
How are you?
I'm fine, you old son of a bitch. Nice to hear your voice.
All right.
What are you calling for? It must
be good news.
Yeah, okay.
I got that package.
This taped phone conversation with a Sydney-based investment broker from 1982 gives a unique insight into another of Kelly's skills, cutting a deal.
All right, Cal.
Okay.
And look, don't waste any time. If it's a question of a few bucks and it's going to take a little time, fuck the time. Spend the money and bang it in.
Yeah.
All right, kid.
Okay.
Bye-bye, Cal.
Yep.
What's more, Kelly felt a bit funny about selling his loot. He wanted to show it off to the public. So, he came up with a solution that let him hang on to his treasure and turn it into a source of renewable revenue. He set up a makeshift museum in an old waterfront shed in Whangaroa. His wife, Rosemary, was the manager.
During the holiday season, it paid its way, yeah. But when the tourists had gone, it was dead, because no one went to Whangaroa in those days. The idea came up of building a proper museum, and Kelly decided it should be done in a boat.
A 100-foot boat that had once transported sugar for the Chelsea sugar factory was acquired and pulled off mudflats near Paihia in the Bay of Islands. Called the Tui, it was refitted with internal stairs that took you down into the large 20-foot wide hull, where relics and treasure were curated and put on display. Kelly Tarlton's Museum of Shipwrecks opened on the 12th of January 1970. Situated near the Waitangi Treaty Grounds, at 30 cents admission, it was a must-see.
And that was our bread and butter. That was, what we were living on.
Only 2 days after the Museum of Shipwrecks opened, Kelly was off on his next treasure hunt. This time, way down to the sub-Antarctic Auckland Islands, searching for the lost gold on the shipwreck of the elusive General Grant. Rosemary was left behind.
This was the days before mobile phones, and I had no idea where he was. But they'd had a wonderful time. They'd been on the Auckland Islands and he'd been chased by big seals, elephant seals, and taken wonderful photos, and they had the time of their life.
It wasn't all fun and games. The crew were diving in freezing cold, surging water that threw boulders around like pebbles, crashing up against jagged cliffs and into submarine canyons. It was maybe the most dangerous diving Kelly had done yet. Kelly never found the General Grant. After witnessing the brutal conditions of the Auckland Islands firsthand, he guessed it had probably broken up, its treasure scattered. Treasure hunting's like that. Sometimes you hit it big, like at the Gelignite, and sometimes you don't. For Kelly's old friends and colleagues, it was all great fun. Being out on boats, hunting for treasure, but it wasn't always easy for Rosemary.
He hadn't found the gold of the General Grant, which was a bit disappointing. But what upset me was they're on a 90-foot boat to Himatana, and it was surfing. and I thought, here I was homeless with 2 children, and here was Kelly surfing on a 90-foot boat.
Kelly took on commercial diving contracts to keep his family afloat, but his passion was always for treasure hunting. He spent every free moment looking over old books and newspaper reports, talking to experts. He mapped out more than 1,000 promising shipwrecks along New Zealand's coasts, and he visited hundreds of them. He brought back pieces of treasure and historical artefacts for his museum, building his celebrity as he went, especially with New Zealand's rapidly growing community of scuba divers. He'd sometimes go out to visit other wreck divers and amateur treasure hunters, looking for trinkets to add to his collection. One was a keen young diver in Wellington called Willie Bullock.
And he was at that stage setting up his first museum up in the far north and wanted a few bits. And I ended up giving him bits and loaning him bits.
What was it like first meeting him? Did you sort of know him by reputation already at this point?
I'd heard about him. Oh yes, yeah. No, it was a great privilege to have him knocking on my door asking to talk to me. I always wanted to go and talk to him. I was too scared.
Kelly employed his suction jet wherever he could. But when treasure was stuck beneath boulders or trapped inside the iron hull of wrecks, he had another technique. This one won him a couple of nicknames, including Jelly Kelly and the Master Blaster. Peter Pettigrew was Kelly's brother-in-law and was a constant part of the diving crew. He knew the methods well.
Kelly taught himself how to use Gelignite underwater.
How do you teach yourself to use Gelignite underwater?
Yeah, no, he was fearless, but he was very safe. I have to say he was not a cowboy at all. Certainly there were a few cowboys in the system underwater, and one or two of them were part of Kelly's team, but they never killed anybody.
Allowed to buy sticks of Gelignite, just say we're blowing up a drain or a few stumps on the farm, sign the book and off you go. It worked just as well underwater, But we were a bit rip and bust, and Kelly, taught me to be a little bit more cautious in what we do,
John Gallagher also assisted on more than a few of these explosive dives.
Kelly was the master blaster and I was his right-hand man. And the boat we were using was a wooden one. So before we set the explosives off, we moved the boat out of the way because if it came up, it could damage the hull. So we had to be a bit careful about that.
How big were these explosions?
Reasonable. Even though around about at 80 or 100 feet, there was enough volume to sort of come out through the surface.
Sounds like a lot of fun.
Oh, it was, yes, yeah, no.
Maybe not so much fun for the fish. You wouldn't get away with it now, but those were different times. One time, when diving on the wrecks of the Wiltshire and the Wairarapa off Great Barrier Island, Kelly was struggling to get access. He'd used up his supply of explosives, so he called up Rosemary for more.
And he said, I need detonators to let off the jelly because he's blowing parts of a wreck. The seaplane used to fly from Paihia to Great Barrier Island, and I had the detonators in my pocket and I had the jelly in my suitcase out the back and I was on a small seaplane and I could have shot him. You wondered if I ever got cross with him. I was not very understanding about that and I wasn't going to go, and he said, if you don't come, I can't do anything. And so he talked me into that.
With an ever-growing crew of keen treasure hunters and the support of his loving, if somewhat exasperated wife, Kelly ticked more and more shipwrecks off his list. In 1974, Kelly found his biggest loot yet. It was one he was only halfway through exploring when he recorded that videotape we played earlier.
My most recent treasure search has been for the Rothschild's jewellery on the 1897 wreck of the SS Tasmania.
On the 29th of July, 1897, the SS Tasmania struck rocks off Table Cape, Mahia Peninsula. That's off the east coast of New Zealand in the Hawke's Bay. Shipwrecks were fairly common in those days, and the sinking wouldn't have been such a big deal if it wasn't for a single piece of luggage left behind by a passenger.
Isidore Rothschild left a case of jewellery in his cabin, which the Reserve Bank estimates to be now worth $100,000.
I've looked this up, and Isidore doesn't appear on the official family tree of the famous Rothschild bankers. But he did have enough cash to launch a private mission to recover his lost bag of jewellery. So maybe he was a black sheep of the family. He hired divers to go down in those old-fashioned helmets with long air hoses and weighted boots. But the wreck was a mess of twisted metal, and gruesomely, the companionways were blocked by the corpses of drowned horses being transported on the ship. Nearly 80 years later, with the benefit of scuba gear, Gelignite, and a new and improved suction dredge, Kelly purchased the rights to the wreck of the Tasmania and decided to have another go at finding its sunken treasure.
I found the wreck 2.5 miles offshore, half buried in the sand and lying in 100 feet of water. Although the ship was draped with trawl nets and badly corroded, I was hopeful we would find Rothschild's cabin still intact, but to our dismay found his cabin had broken up and completely disappeared. All we found was a patch of tile floor to mark the spot where his cabin had been. Everything else had gone over the side and lay buried out in the open sand. Somewhere, not far from this patch of tile floor, lies a suitcase with $100,000 worth of jewellery in it. By this coming summer, I hope at least some of its contents will be on display here in the museum.
But the next summer, just after that video was recorded, disaster struck. And as Kelly's brother-in-law, Peter Pettigrew, tells it, it was all thanks to a government policy which paid farmers a subsidy to clear farmland for grazing sheep.
That involved cutting all the last trees down in every gully and on every ridge. And then a few years later, when the cyclone came along, it washed millions of cubic metres of soil, and what was originally a beautiful wreck, lovely sandy bottom, the whole thing was buried. That's a whole bloody ship buried, so it's like 3 or 4 metres of this black, evil sludge. Talk about wrecking an ecosystem in one fell swoop. So then, when you went to work on the Tasmania, you were working in nil visibility, just this dark hole. That kind of diving is not for the faint-hearted.
It was dark, cold, and dangerous. Sand and mud was constantly collapsing back into the hole Kelly and his crew were digging. There was a serious risk of being buried alive. But after weeks of blasting away with Gelignite, trawling through the ooze, Kelly's crew finally got their reward.
We're basically shoveling the rubble that was in the bottom of the hole into a 200-litre oil drum. Then it got taken up to the boat, and we had a big washing platform on the back of the boat, and we washed it, and there was the Rothschild jewellery glinting at you.
All up, Kelly and his crew recovered about 250 pieces of jewellery from the Tasmania, with an estimated value of over $250,000 in today's money. The discovery of the Rothschild jewels captivated the country. The pieces put on show in the Shipwreck Museum were a massive drawcard. Everyone wanted to cover the story of his treasure hunting success, and Kelly was always happy to share his tales and show his bounty. Kelly's name was becoming synonymous with treasure hunting. So much so that New Zealand's Prime Minister volunteered him for an overseas mission, helping one of the world's most famous filmmakers. David Lean, known for directing epics like The Bridge on the River Kwai, Dr. Zhivago, and Lawrence of Arabia, had stationed himself in Tahiti to write his next film about the infamous mutiny on the Bounty.
And Lean's hasn't made a film for 10 or 11 years since Ryan's Daughter, to go and live in Tahiti for as long as it took to get the script done. The local Tahitians say, oh look, we found one of Captain Cook's anchors, and we know there's 1 or 2 more anchors, we can't find them.
David Lean gave up on his script writing efforts and instead decided to film a documentary about the mission to find and recover the anchors.
And he sitting next to Muldoon on a plane flying around the Pacific somewhere, David Lean is, and he says to Muldoon, have you got any salvage divers in New Zealand who could come up and, we want to try and help find these other 2 anchors for the Tahitians. And Muldoon says, yeah, I'll ring Kelly when I get back. At the side of his mouth, as he always talked. And so Kelly went up to see David Lean.
Kelly actually featured in David Lean's documentary. You can see the whole thing online if you want. We'll put a link in the episode description.
Yes, it's a big anchor, all right. Must be at least 12 feet long. Admiralty pattern. It's well encrusted with coral, as you would expect after 200 years.
In appreciation for his help, Lean gave Kelly a key piece of equipment in his hunt for the anchor, a magnetometer. This was a very expensive piece of equipment which could be used to detect metal deep beneath the water's surface. And it was that piece of equipment which would be critical to help locate the 3rd anchor, the St. John Baptiste. But before he went hunting for that 3rd anchor, there was another adventure, finding a wreck that had been the downfall of treasure hunters for 200 years. In 1980, he tried his hand at finding one of the world's most valuable and notorious wrecks, the Lutine. The Lutine was a British Navy frigate that sank in a storm in 1799, somewhere in a channel between the West Frisian Islands off the northern coast of the Netherlands. The frigate had been carrying a significant shipment of gold when it went down, about $280 million worth in today's money. Even as far back as 1801, there had been efforts to retrieve the treasure. Multiple expeditions were launched, dozens of gold bars and hundreds of coins were recovered. But most of the loot was still thought to be at the bottom of the ocean, and diving on the Lutine was extremely risky. The wreck sat in relatively shallow water, 14 metres at most, but strong tidal currents, freezing cold water and rough weather made diving extremely dangerous. The Lutine had claimed many lives over the years.
I spent Wednesday the 21st of May working on survey information and plotting it on
It was
charts.
around this time that Kelly first started using a portable tape recorder. He used it to capture all the detail of his adventures to be able to reference later.
Small targets showing up which weren't shown on the original chart. Pete Osleton and Steve McIntyre and Ingrid arrived at the airport and we picked them up and went home, went out for dinner.
Steve McIntyre, the young diver who had worked with Kelly on the Tasmania wreck, was part of the imported Kiwi crew.
4 of us were there walking down the road on this island, and on the first morning, and a few of the local old Dutch guys were sitting outside the bars and the cafes with their pipes, and I could see they were looking at us. They knew who we were. They knew we were arriving on the island, and they were asking him stuff. And I said to Jan, "What's going on with these guys?" And he said, "You don't really want to know." And I said, no, I especially want to know now. And he said, "Well, they're asking me if you're the divers from New Zealand and maybe I could introduce them to you and shake their hand," because he said we're never going to see them again, because he said every diver's died on the Lutine. So he said they don't come back. And he said that's basically what they're saying to me. So he said we want to meet them now before it's too late. So we went there knowing that the record of being a diver on the Lutine wasn't great.
The dive was using some of the most cutting-edge magnetometer technology. However, the weather was not in their favour and the conditions became brutal to work in.
6 p.m, the sea is quite choppy now, and at this stage, a few seconds ago, the generator failed and we lost the program on the computer. Everything stopped, of course, when the generator stopped. So rather than muck around putting on a new program, we're now heading back to shore. Also on the last few runs when we were going south, we were getting quite a lot of noise on the magnetometer readings through the ship jerking, I think, on the cable owing to the chop. So now 6:10, we have the magfish aboard, the profiler up, and are heading home through quite a choppy sea.
Kelly remained determined. His crew, however, wasn't happy with all his decisions.
The thing that used to bother me most about it was that we were all using hose gear and helmets and hose, and Kelly was using a tank. And I remember saying to him one day, Kelly, you've got to stop scubaing on this wreck. We were working in massively deep holes, up to 9 metres deep in the mud, and the hole was collapsing on you the entire time. So the risk of burial was constant. And in fact, we all probably had various levels of burial ourselves on the bottom, some worse than others. And I said to Kelly, you know, the boys aren't happy with you scuba diving. We want you to stop doing it in case something happens. And he said, the difference between me scuba diving and you being in there in your helmet, he said, is that you won't have to listen to me screaming for the last 30 seconds. So we kind of left it at that, and we never really talked about it again.
The treasure hunt continued on, and eventually Kelly had Rosemary and his daughters join him. But what was supposed to be a victorious achievement of global proportions had turned into a massive disappointment. Kelly Tarlton experienced it firsthand.
I remember we were on this huge boat and we'd have bicycle races up and down the back of the boat because it was so huge, a tender that would look after oil rigs. It was ginormous, and the winches were about the size of, about my height at the time, and they'd be ripped out of the deck from the storms when they were trying to hold the boat in place. And it was very dangerous. There was a lot riding on it, but he was very keen. He'd using modern technology to go after these gold bars. Unfortunately, it was just there were a lot of targets, and they lost so much time, and they didn't manage to find the right target.
Kelly returned to New Zealand without the loot. But never one to give up, he turned his attention back to completing one of his earlier treasure hunts. Armed with the magnetometer from David Lean and his experience using the technology on the Lutine hunt, he went to find the third anchor, the St John Baptiste. Kelly and Mike Beersley had already successfully recovered an anchor each in 1974. The third anchor continued to be elusive, and it was too much of an alluring challenge to just ignore. So, in 1982, he rustled up a collection of his diving mates and went back to Doubtless Bay to finish the hunt. As with all his treasure hunts, he'd done his research and pored over de Surville's journals. Having the magnetometer was definitely a help, but Peter Pettigrew thinks an equally critical tool was one de Surville himself was using more than 200 years ago.
Kelly, he taught himself how to use a sextant. Not a skill many people nowadays use it. You just ask the sat-nav where you are and it tells you. So we get up there, and I showed you on the wee maps where the boat was, and you plot exactly where he says he was. And if you do that, that's where the anchor is.
Along with Kelly and Peter, the other members of the crew were Kelly's daughter Nicole and Hung Nguyen, a Vietnamese refugee who'd trained as a diver when he was in the South Vietnamese Special Forces. Hung came to New Zealand following the fall of Saigon in 1975 and had been welcomed into Kelly's collection of treasure hunters. He was there when they got a signal from the magnetometer that there was something large and metallic on the seabed.
So we dropped the anchor and we put the gear and we started to swim down. We went down to about 85 feet. Then we swim just a little bit back. And whoa, the dark thing come out from the seabed. Whoa. So the anchor would lay, the arm going up this way, and the anchor happened to be hooked buried down to the stone. It's like a like a rocky stone. It's not a small one, just rocking stone. Anyway, hook it down, completely buried. And the other half going hook up like that. Oh, Kelly, when he excited, a lot of word come out from him. Very exciting.
Nicole Tarlton had been diving with her dad on shipwrecks for a couple of years by this point, but seeing the anchor for the first time was a standout memory.
The thing that I remember most was being next to it and just being blown away by how huge it was.
The team took photos and we've put some of them up on our website if you want to take a look. Hung and Nicole are the divers you can see in the photo. Kelly was the photographer. Kelly took measurements and noted down the exact location so he could return to recover it when he had the necessary resources. No one had any idea that day that he would never return. More than 40 years later, Kelly's notes about the anchor's location have been lost, and nobody has seen it since. But I'm determined to finish that mission. Find that anchor. So I questioned Peter, Hung and Kelly's other mates as closely as I could, and they all agreed on one thing. It had to still be down there.
This fluke is in a reef and it'll never come out again. You'd have to destroy the anchor to get it out.
Kelly, look, if he went up there and looked, he'd find it. It'll be there, absolutely.
But if that's true, why has nobody found it? Professional divers using the latest tech have gone looking, but none of them have found anything. It's a genuine mystery. This isn't a difficult spot to access. There's a dive shop at a campground just down the road, and the inlet where Kelly found it is only a few hundred metres across. If Kelly's old diving mates say that De Surville's anchor is still down there, then it must be, right? There's only one way to find out, and that's to complete Kelly Tarlton's final treasure hunt. But first, we're going to look at answering another question. Who brought this anchor to New Zealand in the first place? Why did they leave it behind? And what makes it such an important part of New Zealand history?
The origins of this voyage, of this expedition, were deeply mysterious.
Thanks for listening to Kelly Tarlton's Final Treasure Hunt. If you like the show, be sure to follow us on your favourite podcasting app. And if you want to help more people find the show, please leave us a review. Kelly Tarlton's Final Treasure Hunt is written and presented by me, Hamish Williams. Our producers are Ali Callahan, William Ray, Phil Vine and Justin Gregory. Our sound engineers are William Saunders, Phil Benge and Mark Chesterman. Our production coordinator is Brianna Juritich and the executive producer is Tim Watkin. Special thanks to the Tarlton family for their support and trust in making this podcast. There is so much more to the life of Kelly Tarlton. There are some great books on his life available. We've made some recommendations on the show's webpage. You can find that at rnz.co.nz/podcasts.